So, Tracie.
Yes.
How's it going?
Good.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
What's going on today?
Last time I was on, we had started reading from a series of emails, exchanges with an ex-Muslim.
Yes.
And that's interesting on a couple accounts. Number one, we rarely get email from Muslims.
Although we do get a lot of email from people complaining we don't talk more about Muslims.
Yes, we do. And we even get fewer emails from people who used to be Muslim.
Yes.
So I thought...
Which is probably why we don't talk about them more.
Right. But I thought that just reading from some of... he said I could use his first name on the air. His first name is Amir. And we talked a little bit last time about his background. He's a retired professor and was raised in a moderate Muslim home.
Okay.
And his family did fairly well. All the children went to college, and he went to study physics in Europe and ended up deconverting after learning about science and becoming more educated. And he just decided that this isn't working for me. The religion versus reality thing is clashing.
Seems like a common story.
Right.
I mean, it is, after all, why so many apologists tie themselves in knots worrying about what's going to happen when they send their kids to college.
Right. Right. So you send them to Baptist college and and it's resolved.
Right. Sometimes not even then.
But anyway, he had written in, and it was in response to some, I guess, something that was on the show, and he wanted to kind of interject some things and talking a little bit about the idea of state-sponsored religion and also the idea of indoctrination of children. And that particularly, I guess, is an issue with him based on some of what he saw growing up. I think he said he was from Pakistan. And his experience with fundamentalist Islam really leaves him concerned. So when he wrote in, he had a lot to say, and I, of course, was very interested in that because we don't hear a lot of information from people saying, look, I was raised Muslim and this is what I think is wrong. And so I felt like sharing that might be just a rare thing to be able to share.
Okay.
And so last time I was on, we read from his first introductory thoughts. But he wrote back again.
Do you want to recap that real quick?
Well, it was kind of a lot of material, okay. and it does, what happened is he just wrote in with his concerns, and I had sent him over to, I guess, a Dawkins article where Dawkins had written about state-sponsored religion in England and was critical of that. And when Amir wrote back, he said, I was unaware of Dawkins' criticism of this. However, I think I'm more concerned with the way that parents work with the state to get the children indoctrinated. So his concern really was more from a family level and the idea of sending your children to religious schools to indoctrinate them further, and how the parents are really key in ensuring that the children grow up with this indoctrination, and that there's and it's not, to him, he's just like, I don't know why Dawkins wasn't more critical of the parents. Well,
right.
When I wrote him back, I said that was because the letter that Dawkins wrote was specifically addressing some issues with the government at that time. So it wasn't really just like an essay.
Dawkins has made that controversial statement that, raising religion and telling them that they are Christian children is child abuse. Well,
and that's part of what he talked about in the letter that I sent him to,
right.
was the idea of how we label children with religious labels. We wouldn't do that. Like when parents
right.
are, for example, Republican or Democrat, we don't say, those children are Democrats.
Right.
But if the parents are Catholic, we'll say the entire family is Catholic, and that, oh yeah, those are Catholic kids. And it's like, well, how can they be Catholic kids? How can they even comprehend? How can they make an assessment or an informed decision on something that,
right.
most adults, when you question them, don't even understand?
Yeah.
So with that, we'll just go into a little bit here. He said he thinks that parents are a crucial link. I'm reading from his email. Without their cooperation, the churches cannot reach the children. That said, in general, parents should have the right to teach the children what they see fit. This is appropriate because they are naturally motivated to seek the best for their children.
When he says churches, he's not talking about Islam, is he?
Well, what happened is when I responded, I responded with the idea of his concern was about parents and the Islamic schools and turning out potential terrorists or teaching children hatred.
Right.
And what I wrote him was that although I understood his concerns, I've been through the dialogue before of what can parents teach their children, and there is no line. I mean, I don't know, as much as people will say, well, why would you support, religious indoctrination? My response is, like, living in a predominantly Christian nation, if they were going to pass laws about what you could and couldn't teach your children, they'd probably force me to teach them Christianity if it was going to come down to what does the nation want. So I can't support the idea that just because something is popular or just because I think it's wrong, I have to say, just based on that alone, that you can't teach your child about X, Y, Z because there's other...
And I've mentioned this on the show many times. I don't want to teach my 5-year-old son that he is an atheist child.
Right.
But on the other hand, I am an atheist, and I'm on a TV show, for goodness sake. So I mean, it's not exactly a subtle influence in my life. So
Right.
I can't help but talk about it. So I mean,
Right.
I speak about it in general terms. I mean, I tell him a lot of people believe in this God thing, and
Right.
You're free to believe that if you want to someday. But frankly, your mother and I think it's ridiculous.
And I mean, Matt has brought up before on the show how, teaching your child that left is right and right is left and red is green and green is red. He's like, at what point wouldn't that be, mental abuse? But at the same
but
time...
on the other hand, if you really believed that right is left...
Right, and that's the point. The idea to me is who draws that line?
Right.
Who would draw the line of you can tell your child this, you can't tell your child this, you must tell your child this? I mean, even... It's hard to say, it's hard to not step in when you think something is incorrect that someone is doing with their child. Right. But you have to draw a line somewhere. We tend to draw it at real harm, like real physical harm. That's where our culture leans toward.
It does depend to a large degree on what the real, on how much harm there is. I mean, have you ever seen the TV show Big Love?
I haven't.
Oh, now that I'm out of grad school, I've just started, catching up on DVDs of shows that I've been meaning to see. And, Big Love deals with this very strong Mormon community with various levels of beliefs about different things, including polygamy.
Okay.
And the guy who's, for all purposes, the villain, very creepily has a 13-year-old wife.
Okay.
Who is creepy herself, but I mean, you can kind of understand that she's creepy because of the way she was raised.
Absolutely.
And there's an example of something that society frowns on completely apart from the religious aspects of it, which is somebody underage.
There you're in questions
with
of
a very
consent.
old man, yeah.
So then you run into questions of consent, where we look at certain things and we say this is an
But
adult
I mean,
thing.
to a large extent, a lot of the issue about how you raise your kids is an issue of consent, because what you fill your heads with, they don't necessarily have a say in themselves. You know what I mean?
Correct.
So,
Correct.
yeah.
But I look at it, it's like, where do we draw those lines? And usually when I see lines drawn where the police will step in and society will say you cannot do this, it generally involves physical harm to the child.
Right.
Where the kid is being physically hurt. And I think that's part of with the age of consent with sexuality comes in, is that, at a certain point we look at that and say, you have to be mentally aware in a way that this child perhaps is not able to understand, so that she can make an informed decision about what is going on here. She's not aware of her choices, and she hasn't been made aware of choices. And then there's a whole issue, I guess, of homeschooling, which again, just make it clear, because I know we always get the battery of emails.
So it's always my fault, usually.
To lay off, to waylay the battery of emails. I have no objection to someone homeschooling their child, but I do have objections to homeschooling your child in an effort to keep them unaware of what is out in the world in reality.
Exactly.
When you're trying to, deny your child access to information, and that's your purpose in homeschooling, then I don't support that at all. So anyway, we got into sort of this discussion, and I was talking to him a little bit about, how I would not tell a Christian, you cannot teach your child your beliefs. But when he writes back, he sort of goes into what he talks about. He says it is appropriate because they're naturally motivated to seek the best for their children, that it's appropriate to allow people to teach their children what they think is best. Also, as a practical matter, there are no real alternatives, and that's where I kind of fall. It's like, although there are certain things where I look at it and I say, I would never do this with a child. Like when were you at Jesus Camp? Did you see that?
Yeah, I saw
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I look at that and I'm just like, I can't. It was hard to watch people do this to their children.
Right.
But at the same time, what are the real alternatives? It's like if we're going to step in and interfere with that, how long is it before someone steps in and says you're not fit to raise a child because you're not religious?
Right.
And I wouldn't want that. I mean, it's a scary line. And at some point, what happens is it's so ambiguous that we simply say, unless it's just horribly egregious, unless you're breaking your child's arm, we're not stepping in.
I mean, I'm generally an advocate of the notion that the way to stop people from doing stupid and dangerous things is education.
Yeah.
But when the philosophy actually is against educating people, then what can you do about that?
Correct. Yeah, and I've made that comment, I think, with Amish, the idea of stopping your child's education at a certain level.
Right.
And saying you can only be educated through the 6th grade or the 8th grade,
Yeah.
and then it stops. And it's like, well, in that case, I mean, aren't you really creating like a captive audience for your religion? I mean, how does someone leave when you've got an 8th grade education? What does this child do?
In a way, although they don't see it that way because obviously they don't understand it.
But when you have generations that have been denied the choice, it's almost like you reach a point where you don't even know that you're denied the choice.
Right.
And then what do you do?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I guess I'm just all for information and people can do what they want with the information, but I think it should be accessible. I don't think that stopping people from ideas or trying to ban ideas or bar ideas is ever a good thing. Even bad ideas should be examined.
Of course.
And even if they're examined and they're criticized. So anyway, let's see. He says, consider, however, the madrasas in northwestern part of Pakistan. These religious schools teach the pupils a lot of hatred, which is directed toward all infidels. It stems from the holy book Quran, in which God unequivocally states that Jews and Christians are not your friends. If you befriend them, you become one of them. Recently, it was reported that Saudi schools were using a textbook that stated that Jews and Christians were sons of pigs and monkeys. And this was interesting because later, when I told him that I wanted to use some of what he had written, he said he wanted to go look it up. He said, let me go provide you the references to this because a lot of things I said require, a reference, and I want to make sure that you have that when you present the material. So he sent me the references, and I just want to say that I'll be kind of interspersing these. It says, Jews and Christians are not your friends. That's what he wrote. The same message appears at one more place in the Quran, but I couldn't find it for now. I asked one of my Muslim relatives about this. The reply was that the Prophet was giving his followers advice about dealing with Jews and Christians during his lifetime. So it was from Surah, verse 51. Believers do not take Jews or Christians as friends. They are but one another's friends. If any one of you takes them for his friends, then he is surely one of them. God will not guide evildoers.
Historically, Jews and Christians haven't always been the greatest of friends either, if I remember right.
Right. It depends on the time, I guess. Verse 56 through 64 goes on to say, O believers, do not take as your friends the infidels or those who received the scriptures before you, which would be Jews and Christians, and who scoff and jest at your religion, but fear God if you are believers. And then the Jews and Christians, when he mentioned that they are sons of apes and swines, he gave me, let's see, I guess it's 5 verse 57, and the Quran is broken out in these like numbered chapters, so this would be like chapter 5 verse 57. I'm not sure exactly how they're labeled, but when you look it up, you'll have a book, like book 1, book 2.
Yeah.
And so this was 5 verse 57. O you who believe, do not take for guardians those who take your religion for a mockery and a joke, from among those who were given the book, which is generally the Bible, before you and the unbelievers, and be careful of your duty to Allah if you are believers. And when you call to prayer, they make it a mockery and a joke. This is because they are people who do not understand. Say, O followers of the book, do you find fault with us except that we believe in Allah and in what has been revealed to us and what was revealed before, and that most of you are transgressors? Say, shall I inform you of him who is worse than this in retribution from Allah? Worse is he whom Allah has cursed and brought his wrath upon, and of whom he made apes and swine, and he who served the shaitan, which is Satan. These are worse in place and more erring from the straight path. You'll have to forgive me. I'm definitely not as well-versed in reading from the Quran as I would be from the Bible, so it's a little bit broken, and I apologize for that. But the verse is referring to apes and swine, and it's a little confusing, but the context throughout that little section is obviously referencing Christians and Jews, like repeatedly. So that was the verse that he wanted to use. And I note that one interpretation I came across equated this with God downgrading the souls of Christians and Jews to the status of the souls of animals as a curse. Okay. So in other words, one of the apologetics offered for the verse was that God cursed the Jews and Christians and downgraded them to have souls like animal souls. Oh. And that's what that means when it says that they're the offspring of swines and apes.
It doesn't mention him cursing the atheists, though, does it?
Thankfully, yeah.
Of course, we do.
I think we're still infidels.
We do make a mockery of their religion, so I guess we fall in the category.
And anyway. I would say that we probably do fall into infidels, and there are some things about unbelievers, so we're not totally off the hook there.
Okay.
Anyway.
That always kind of throws a wrench in Pascal's Wager, though. I mean, in the sense that, you know, if you're willing to believe something just because it might be true, then you better be Islam.
Yeah, I mean...
You better be a Muslim.
Yeah, Pascal's Wager is really a sorry apologetic.
Yeah.
That is unbelievably tenacious. I don't know how there's certain ones that I just don't know how they stay around.
It's really simple to understand, and it sounds really technical because it sort of relies on probability theory, but not really.
I think what happens is it sounds very simple.
Yes.
And that when people hear
it,
it, they're
sounds
just like, well,
simple,
how could
but
you
people
not
think
see
they
this?
sound smart saying it. So,
I guess.
So it's easy to use.
Yeah, but when you're raised as a believer, that Pascal's Wager, which for anybody that might not know, it's just simply the question of, it's the idea that, well, if you believe in God, you get all these great religious benefits that you wouldn't get as a non-believer, and you don't go to hell or whatever.
Right. Well, Pascal was a very accomplished mathematician, actually. So what he said was, we don't know what the odds for God existing might be, but even if they're very, very small, the payoff is infinite if you're right.
Right, so go ahead and believe. And then if you don't believe, you potentially lose out on all these benefits, and you might end up in hell, and so it's better to just go on and believe, which the problems with it are myriad, starting with the idea of, how do I make myself believe something just by willing it to be so? You know, in the same respect, it'd be like saying, if you just would believe in leprechauns, maybe you'll find a pot of gold. Well, that's great, but I have to believe in leprechauns first, and it's not, I mean, I can say I do, but can I really do that?
I think psychologically telling yourself that you should believe something can be self-fulfilling, but I mean, I think the best counter to Pascal's Wager is just to say that there are an infinite number of things that might be true, including Islam. And based on the passages you just read, it's always sounded to me like Islam has it in worse for Christians and Jews than just garden variety atheists. So if you're not going to be a Muslim, you'd better be an atheist, just to hedge your bets.
I guess.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I don't care for Pascal's Wager. Anyway, this also, let's see, he says this also originated in the Quran. He's talking about the pigs and monkeys thing. The recent horrible crime of a teenage girl being strangled by her Muslim father can be directly traced to detailed instructions given to men for handling rebellious women. I can give references if you like. With all this in mind, it is not even in the interest of Muslims to let madras teach all these horrible things to their children. It certainly is problematic for the human tribe. For the government to step in and eliminate madras, thereby infringing on the rights of parents to teach their children what they see fit, seems like a good idea to me. And just to give the Quran quote, let's see, instructions to beat women would be in number 4, verse 34. And he says about this is Amir talking, I think you did read this and discuss it with a Muslim. My comment is that the whole chapter on women displays a certain frame of mind. Instruction to beat them is not that much of a surprise when one comes across it. Consider the verse 19 that gives instructions to deal with women who commit indecency. I'm not sure I completely understand it. Seems pretty bad anyway, I interpret it. Remember, this is supposedly coming from a God who created the universe that extends over 13 billion light years in every direction with millions of galaxies, each with millions of stars, with the sun being just one of them. Then there's the entire world of molecules, atoms, elementary particles. That God is telling me to beat women. So, number 4, verse 34 says, the translation says anyway, and I in the one dialogue I had with a Muslim apologist, he said that he disagreed with the translation. Which,
I've never had a conversation with a Muslim apologist. I'm kind of jealous.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of similar to Christian apologetics where you'll read it and they'll say, well, that's a bad translation. And
okay,
then
I'm not missing anything.
Yeah,
then.
and so I read it and I said, all I have is the English translation. I don't read Arabic,
Right.
so what can I say? You know, hopefully God will make a better translation one day, and then I can understand it. So men are the maintainers of women because Allah has made some of them to excel others, and because they spend out of their property. The good women are therefore obedient, guarding the unseen as Allah has guarded. And as to those on whose part you fear desertion, admonish them. So if you think your wife is going to leave you, admonish her, and leave them alone in the sleeping places, don't have sex with her, and beat them. Then if they obey you, do not seek a way against them. Surely Allah is great, and is high, great.
What a guy.
So, you know, after you beat them and you don't have sex with them and you tell them that they're bad, if they do what you say, then be forgiving. So, anyway, so he thinks that eliminating this kind of ideology is probably a good thing when it comes to indoctrinating children into this. A fair fraction, this is back to the original letter, a fair fraction of Pakistanis are not given to such a literal interpretation of the Quran, which is another thing you run into with the Christian apologetics.
Yes.
You'll read it and they'll say, well, you're taking it literally. And it's like, oh,
Right.
well.
I mean, it actually crossed my mind when he was saying that unbelievers are the sons of pigs and monkeys. Literally? I mean, you know, if you met somebody's parents, then you know.
I always think to myself, though, when I see that, it's just like, well, I wish you could be here when I read this and so you could tell me what God meant to say. Because, you know, obviously he didn't mean to say what he said. And that happens, I think, way often. There's so many times when you'll come across something and you'll say, look, you know, I even had one where you have in, I guess it's Acts, where it says that Judas bought a field with the money he was given for betraying Jesus, and then he falls down and he splits open and dies. And then you have in the Gospels, like one of the, I want to say Matthew, but I'm not positive, but in one of the Gospels it recounts Judas' death. It says that he hung himself and that he threw the money back to the priest before he hung himself.
Right.
Well, the apologetic, and I told this to Don Baker, who's another co-host, and who was raised without religion. And when I first told him what the apologetic was, he thought I was making up a joke. Like, he didn't think I was serious. And then when I sent him a website, he wrote back and he said, I thought you were kidding. The apologetic is that when Judas was given the money, he went back, threw it back to the priest. Then, according to the gospel version, the priest went and bought a field. Well, in Acts, when it says that Judas bought the field, it means that the priest bought the field, but they used Judas' money, so it's Judas buying the field. And that's the apologetic reason why Acts says Judas bought the field.
Okay.
And I'm like, all right, that's, you know, that would be like if I was going to pay you for something you did for me, and you said, oh, no, you don't need to pay me. Right. And so I go out to dinner, and I say, Russell bought me dinner because he didn't take the money. I mean, or it's not even that. It would be like saying you bought dinner for yourself. I mean, because it's like, you know, Judas bought the field, and it's like, well, but the priest bought the field, so, I mean, I don't know. But that's the kind of thing you run into, where it's just like, okay, so Acts, you're assuming that all of this stuff, and instead of taking Acts at what it says, which is Acts says Judas bought the field, you just simply say, well, Matthew says that the priest bought it, so it must have been that the priest bought it, but it's just saying that Judas did. And the reason for that must be because it was his money to begin with. And I'm just like, okay, so any contradiction, you're just going to say simply cannot be. It cannot be.
Right.
And you come at it with that. You come at it with the reading of no matter what it says, it is not a contradiction. It will not be a contradiction. And
yeah, and it's such a convoluted waste of time when the easiest answer is it's all made up.
right.
But then again, you hear also Christians making the excuse that the 4 different versions of the gospel story are, well, it's like 4 people describing a car accident, and they don't all remember the things the same way. Why can't they just say, okay, then some of them got it wrong?
Well, I think what they're saying isn't just that they remember incorrectly. What they're saying is that your point of view, but depending on where you stand with the accident, is going to make a difference in how you describe it. So they are not willing to say that anybody says anything wrong. They're saying that it's about perspective. Like one gospel is written to the Jews, so it's going to have this leaning toward the Jews, and another gospel is written to the Gentiles, and so it's going to have this leaning toward Gentiles. And that's why there's certain things that are different. But my problem comes in, it's one thing if someone says, well, from the angle I was at, it looked, it really did look like the impact was over here, whatever, and you describe that, and somebody else describes pretty much a similar thing from a different point of view. But when you get into a point where you're saying it was a red Toyota and somebody else says, no, it was a black truck. It was a truck, but it was a black truck.
Well,
it's like, well, was it a red truck or a black truck? I mean, how dark can red get?
More than that, I think some of the Bible verses point to the idea that one of them says the accident was in Cleveland and the other one says it was in Detroit.
Yeah, when you get into weird things like that, that's when you really have to start, and like I said, it's like when you're looking at Acts and it says Judas bought this field, and then literally you have to say, well, it doesn't mean what it says. In order to make sense, it can't mean what it says, and therefore it must mean something different. And whatever I can come up with, that's what it means.
And yet they can't just say, this part is wrong, because it's not allowed.
Or that these stories were, for hundreds of years, word of mouth, or for at least, 100 years, were word of mouth stories. And that you get different people recording what someone told them, and one person says, this is the story I heard, that he threw the money back, and then he went and hanged himself because he felt so bad about it. And then somebody else says he bought this field and he tripped and fell and split his self open on something. And I've even heard that described that in this twice. The one I heard was he hung himself from a high cliff, went down so hard the rope snapped.
Yeah.
Then popped his head off or whatever. He comes down, hits the field, and busts open.
Right.
So that's why Acts says
he hangs himself and then basically falls down and
then
explodes.
Right, and that's why Acts says he exploded, and the gospel says that he hung himself. Well,
now, I was knowing about this. I was watching The Passion of the Christ very carefully when it came out, and they don't bother with any of that nonsense. He hangs himself and it's over.
Yeah, that's the.
He doesn't worry about putting things together.
If you ask most Christians, I would say that there's a good number of Christians who have never even heard the story in Acts. They've never even read that story, and who, if you were to tell them, I've seen Christians respond online and say that there is no such verse where Judas explodes. And it's like, yes, it's in Acts.
Right.
And there it is. I mean, but it doesn't matter, because if you show it to them, the first thing they're going to do is go and look up whether or not there's an apologetic explanation. And whatever explanation is offered is what they will respond with. And so with the Judas thing, you have this whole issue. There's another one. There was so when I went to church, I remember somebody at my church was saying that it was very common for people to hang themselves in the Middle East like that, and they just would do it from cliffs and bust off and explode, and that happens. It was just common during that time. And so the next one that I heard was somebody that was saying that he hung until he rotted, and then when he rotted through, that's when he fell and exploded, because he was so distended from gases and bacterial crap that he just blew up. Now, wait.
So,
here's the thing.
The Bible sort of isn't chronological. It's like a Faulkner novel. They just say things at different times.
But here's the thing. It said that what they were saying is that if you go to India, that this is common in India, right? Well, I did a show a while back on suicide, and one of the questions that I had in my mind was there some sort of, I thought, okay, surely the Romans weren't going to leave bodies dangling like all around until they rot, on the roadside. So it's very unlikely to me that the same government that came up with the sewage system,
Aqueduct.
yeah, is going to say, let's just leave rotting bodies. You know, we don't need to pick this up. It's like, not a problem. So I'm going, okay, this doesn't seem likely to me that a body would be allowed, or that it would be common for a body to just rot on a rope. So I looked it up because I thought, well, maybe this was some Jewish thing. I'm like, maybe the Jews have some sort of, you can't touch them if they're a suicide, kind of like the Catholic, they won't bury them on hallowed ground or whatever, So I'm like, maybe they have some sort of thing where you can't do religious rites, and he's, can't. Well, there is something in one part of the Bible that says something about a suicide is cursed. However, when I looked it up, I found nothing historically and nothing current, even among the most conservative Jewish websites I could find. I found not one rabbi who would say that you shouldn't do rites for a suicide. They simply said there should be restricted rites depending on the same
objection you just raised about the Romans and cleanliness. I mean, the Jews with their obsessive not eating pork and
and purification rites, left and right,
doing all those sorts of things. I find it hard to believe that.
I could find nothing to justify the idea that anyone would leave a body to rot on a rope. I found nothing.
Not in that age, no.
And even that was when I finally saw there was a couple of suicides in the Old Testament that are mentioned where the people were actually revered, and Samson was one of them. And I was just like, suicide is not, you know what I mean? There's a whole apologetic regarding suicide, but nothing that indicates that I could find that historically or currently there's any problem with burying a person that committed suicide. And one of the things they talked about was that the rites should be restricted to rites for the family and not for the person, because the person has committed this horrible crime. But, even that, I was like, well, I can't really find where it's a crime. It's not listed in the laws anywhere, so I don't know. But anyway, that's kind of a sidetrack, I guess.
Should I mention, I'd just like to point out the number that's up on your screen. We are a live call-in show, so if you'd like to start lining up calls for whenever we're done with this topic, we'd be happy to take your calls in a few minutes.
Because we know you're not watching playoffs.
Well,
nobody cares if the Patriots win today.
The ones who are watching today are really dedicated, so.
That's right.
So call.
Okay, so let's see, what else have I got besides monkeys and pigs? Let's see, a fair fraction of Pakistanis.
Those would be great mascots.
For the Jews and the Christians.
No, for football teams. Although
the
I'm
Jews
not
could
sure
not
who
have
would
a pig
take
mascot.
on their pig. A pig, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess gorillas would be pretty. It's a tough animal.
Yeah, maybe a wild boar.
Yeah. There you go. A fair fraction of Pakistanis are not given to such a literal interpretation of the Quran, though very few will admit it. I can recall situations in which my mother was seriously conflicted when the choice had to be made between the strict teachings of Islam or the ways of the West for me. The best future for me, my parents decided, lay with the Western society. They opted for it even though they believed that eternal damnation in hell awaits parents who neglect their duty to raise children as prescribed by Islam. I believe that if the parents can be enlightened to the point that they doubt whether they know everything, the best interest of the children can become more a matter of rational discussion than fear-based adherence to the religion. And I think that that's kind of an interesting comment, that he says that if the parents can be enlightened to the point that they doubt whether they know everything. And it's like, how many times have you heard that from an apologist, that you atheists think you know everything? You think you know everything. Otherwise, how can you say that there is no God? That's right. How many times has that been put forward? And yet, it's like, you get into the whole lack of belief, and you get into the idea of, am I all-knowing if I say there's no such thing as leprechauns? Am I being too arrogant to make such a claim? But at some point, when you look at what's going on, it's like, wow, that's some real projection happening, because I have yet to meet the Christian who doesn't think that they've got the answer to everything right there in that book.
They don't think they know everything. They just think that they know the guy who knows everything, and they understand what he's thinking.
They know everything they need to know.
Right.
Yeah, and everything you should need to know. And you don't need to know anything else. So
yeah,
stop
and if
asking
you're
questions.
bothered by dealing with a book that hasn't been updated in 2,000 years, then, you must not believe anything at all.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, you don't.
I recently speculated that if I were God and I really cared about people understanding what I was thinking, I would give like a State of the Universe address every 10 years or so.
Just say, yeah, here's what's
Just
going on
show
that I
up
am not into.
Right.
There's the don't list and the do list for this year.
Right.
You know.
Doesn't have to mess with anything, doesn't have to nullify anybody's free will, just has to show up on every TV set and pool of water in the world
it would be nice
and
if,
talk to people.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there are some people that it would be nice if a little bit of, and not even free will, but just free action were curbed. I mean, you know, we understand that it's good to curb some free action, like, you know, Ted Bundy it was good to curb his freedom of action.
Right.
And, you know, there's a lot of, like, children who are being abused behind closed doors that nobody knows about except for presumably God, and if he could take some steps to sort of preempt us until, you know, we have to wait until we find out about it to do something about it, but presumably he could do something about it now, so that might be nice.
Yeah.
So anyway, I cannot get my close Muslim relatives to engage in a useful discussion about religion. Some avoid it because it is blasphemy to even say some things. Others do not concede that one should be able to understand. And I mean, I've heard that too. You don't need to understand. It's just a mystery.
Right.
You don't need to understand
He works in mysterious
Yeah.
ways.
If you, and that's the other
who
thing.
Who are you to ask questions?
If you should come up with something that appears to be a contradiction, to which the Christian themselves, as in a personal matter, like the apologetic, especially apologetic fundamentalists, and I want to make that clear too. Generally, that's who I'm talking about. When you can come up with something that for which there is no easy answer, the answer becomes, it's one of those things that we just don't know.
Right.
So there is no further questioning.
Or they'll plead personal ignorance, like, you know, I'm not good enough at apologetics, but I bet that if you emailed this bigwig apologist and leave me alone, then...
Right. But, I mean, the idea, though, is that should you come up with, like, an ironclad contradiction, the response is simply, we're not meant to understand everything.
Right.
So it's bang. It just shuts down right there.
Right. Then why were you arguing apologetics with me in the first place?
Right. Let's see, where was I? In fact, the Holy Book states that it is fruitless for us to come up with arguments since, quote, to God belongs the final argument. Nevertheless, I do want to keep trying, and he's talking about with his dialogues with his relatives. Perhaps one should be very gentle and not provoke defensive approach on their side. What science does know and how successful scientific theories are is not understood by many. In fact, the scientific method is not generally known. Here is an amusing example. On our website, under the section Interact Online, I once found the following criticism of the theory of evolution. Darwin could be wrong. He was not infallible. I could not find it again, so it may not be the exact quote, but as I remember it. Anyway, I had to wonder where this person was coming from. He was comparing Darwin's life work and all the work done by his predecessors to come up with this detailed theory with statements made by the, quote, infallible ones. Of course, the infallible ones need merely state corroborating evidence, and detailed explanations are unheard of. This person must not be aware of the fact that today there's a huge volume of information in support of the theory and no known established scientific facts to contradict it. Finally, let me briefly comment on your statement, and he quotes me. I worry about how many things are in my own head that I don't know about. How many teachings do I not question because they are so common to me that I don't even see that they are not natural parts of the human experience. And my point to him there was the idea that, you know, once you deconvert, well, not just me. I mean, I've heard other people say this, but I'm not speaking for 100% of the people who have deconverted. But if you are like me and the few people I've spoken to about it, there is this idea of, if I could be so misguided in this major belief, what other things am I misguided about? Or in what other areas has this messed with my head to the point that I now can't even understand that things that I think that's just me or that's just normal for people is really the product of an indoctrinating upbringing.
Right.
I can't ever really know.
Well, you know, I'm one of the few people I know who was never converted away from Christianity. I mean, you know, I was raised an atheist all my life. And my parents were both scientists. And I think the idea that I always had is that nobody knows everything. And anything that you think you know might be wrong, and just deal with it. And I went through a period where I was worried about the fact that, like, what if the world isn't real? What if, I mean, this was before the Matrix came out and gave us a useful analogy to it. But, I mean, what if nothing is right? Or even, what if the Christians are right? How can I know that I'm not wrong? And the answer is, I can't. But all I have to go on are probabilities, and basically I could be wrong. But you got to pick something that appears to have the highest likelihood of being true, and eventually, something may happen that makes you change your mind, and you just have to be ready to change your mind when that happens. And in the meantime, do the best you can.
Right. I mean, I agree with you. I guess my point is that it's almost like I would think that the feeling that you would have if you were 25 years old and your parents had died and you're going through the papers and you find out you're adopted. And you're going, whoa, what else didn't they tell me? Or what's the story that, and then you're sitting there thinking like, all these things that I believed based on that one belief turned out to be incorrect. And I accepted this without question, that I was my parents' child, and yet it was never true. And so now what does that mean for me?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a certain difference between, I mean, I understand that everyone's going to go through life, and there's certain things that you're going to learn that you say, oh, I was under a different impression, and you're going to adjust your worldview based on that. But when you come out of something like Christianity, you've got like the entire basis for your worldview was a belief that you thought was just inherent. That then you come to realize this was not inherent. It seemed inherent because of the level of indoctrination, especially early indoctrination, that caused me to believe that these feelings were just natural feelings that everyone has, which is why I don't believe you as an atheist don't have them. You're just denying it. This is why you get such an adamant response from the Christian who says, you just can feel it. You just can feel it. It's just there. It's in you.
Right.
Because that's what this person really believes. And then when you come out of that and you realize, whoa, yes, there are feelings, but they're self-induced. And this is something that I did to myself and that other people did to me, especially as a child, that made me grow up thinking this is just a natural reality. And it's not a natural reality. It's completely based on nothing real.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And it's very weird. It's like waking up out of the Matrix.
Yeah.
Hey, it looks like we're